Good morning and welcome to the American Library Association's virtual annual conference. My name is Rose Dawson. Yes, for all of you Titanic lovers, that is my real name. I'm a life member of ALA, BCALA, and the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill School of Library and Information Science. A former youth services librarian who eventually grew up, and I currently serve as the director of the Alexandria Library. We were the recipient of the 2020 ALA Excellence in Programming Award and a recipient of the 2020 John Cotton Dana Award. Now, I am thrilled this morning to be able to introduce you all to Andrew Aydin, who has served more than 13 years on the staff of the late Congressman John Lewis. And I had the pleasure of meeting Andrew in 2014 when March Book One received a CSK Honor Award. Yes, I did happen to be on that committee, by the way. In 2018, Andrew came and spoke with my book club of 18 to 23-year-old incarcerated young men, thanks to a Truth and Racial Healing Transformation grant from ALA and the Kellogg Foundation. And I just want to thank him again for his authenticity, his openness, and his willingness to be so real with those young men. They invited him back to their quote unquote graduation, and he left, oh my gosh, he left truly a lasting impression with them. So he's the co-author of the award-winning March book trilogy, and the new book, Run, Book One, will be released in August. Welcome, Andrew, to our coffee talk. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Rose. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you are so welcome. So let's just hit the ground running.
Okay.
How in the world do you follow up with a runway success like March?
There's so much pressure that you really have to just go back to what you did with every other book.
Mhm.
It's a process that you hone over time. You try and be as honest as possible. You do as much research as you possibly can, and you try and let the story find you. It's like the opening scene of the book is a incident that I never read about in any other civil rights history except for maybe one sentence description. And when you go into the primary sources, which we became so reliant on in making March, we were reading these firsthand newspaper accounts of John Lewis just 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, going and getting arrested again, and then the Klan marching in their largest hooded march in more than 40 years in Georgia. It finds you. You just tell the story. As the congressman would say, you make it real, you make it plain.
You know, I have had a chance to see the galley, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And that did hit me right off the bat that you started out so strong. Now, can you tell us about letters and their significance where the congressman was concerned and the role they played?
Well, first I should say I started off in the congressman's office answering his mail. So for me, it was my introduction to him. I remember being so intimidated trying to learn John Lewis's voice and then write in it that I really practiced. I mean, I would write just anything in his voice. We would play, almost like we would write these fake letters to each other in the office as I tried to get better. And then that became, in many ways, the entry point for me to then becoming his campaign press secretary, and then being the person who started his social media accounts and ran all of his tweets. And I think when you look at his relationship with mail, it was a natural extension to move into social media then, because he would get all of his news, all of his information through the mail. It was the way he stayed connected to the world, whether he was in a hospital bed or in an office, wherever he was. That was how he stayed connected. And then when social media came about, he really gravitated towards it because it was another way to be connected. And so the experience of writing his letters set me up to be able to understand how to write in his voice. There's that old joke, I would have written something shorter, but I didn't have enough time. Being able to be brief and to the point and succinct and understand not just his word choice, but the turns of phrase and the ways in which he put pauses into his sentence so you knew where to put the comma, or it's like there's examples today where we confront it where like people will paraphrase him, and I kind of like cringe because I'm like, nope, that's not. They'll say he said vote was powerful, almost sacred, and they'll say like it was a powerful nonviolent weapon, but he never said weapon. He would always say it's the most powerful nonviolent tool or instrument we have in a democratic society, right? And understanding that level of someone's speech is incredibly difficult, but it only comes about if you love that person, because that's the only way you're paying that much attention. You have to, it's like sitting at your grandfather's knee and listening to everything he says and soaking it in like a child. Like that's how I felt so much of the time with him, where he would take a different tone, right? You know him with that serious, ready to go voice he would use. And when we would speak in private, he had this, like he would do this thing where he would get like a really high pitch. He would go, ooh, and like, just like tease you that, and it's understanding the different sides of a person, because you have to understand what voice you're bringing to that occasion too. That is not a skill that you find in a book. You have to be a student of a person who understands it and who can use it, because that weight of your words has to be earned. And in the letters, in the tweets then, and then later in the graphic novels, the graphic novel process became this exercise in extrapolating that voice into a sort of different kind of narrative. So that in my head, it really is that same student sitting at his grandfather's knee, listening to his voice, listening to how he would say it to you. And it's not the voice that you hear in a speech. It's the quiet voice that we heard in private. And that's the voice we use in March and we use in Run. And when we're writing this out, okay, don't laugh at me, but I would read it to him in his voice. So I would do something, I'd have it written, and then I'd basically be doing the John Lewis impersonation to John Lewis to model it, and then he would do it back, and then we would know we got the voice right.
One of the things that has left a lasting impression on me is the backmap where this book is concerned. I mean, it is quite impressive, to say the least. Now, what was the research process like for you? I mean, how are you keeping track of all of the primary sources?
With this story, because it is so different, right? I think we're going through a moment where we're reimagining the scope of the civil rights movement. John Lewis says that the movement ended to him with the signing of the Voting Rights Act. But we can't understand what's happening today without understanding what happened in that year following. And when you go into a period of time that is kind of understudied, it's really important to explain why you're saying what you're saying, where the sources are, because it feels like if we did our job, people are going to be citing this. They're going to look at this. They're going to want to have more questions. They're going to want to go see where we got our information from. And then there's always that little piece where folks look at comics as kind of less than literature.
Yes.
And establishing the fact that this was as much a scholarly work as a memoir, right? That we were not just relying on John Lewis's memories, though those are incredible. And they always used to joke he had the best memory of anybody in the movement. If you wanted to know what happened, they would say, you asked John. But for this, we had to show our work, right? It's just like in algebra class, right? You got to show your work. And so we thought it was really important that we demonstrate that. We didn't have the opportunity to do that with March, even though we brought that same level of research. And this way, for students and for teachers and for librarians, when you have that curious reader who wants to know more, it's a jumping off point so that they can go and do their own research and understand where it was we were coming from and what else is out there.
I mean, that's fabulous, because you're right. We send students come to the library looking and say, well, I have to have 3 sources and I can only use one encyclopedia and one internet link. And so to know that you could who would think that you would find all that information in the back of a graphic novel? It is so wonderful. Now, as you worked on these books, was there anything that you learned that surprised you?
There was a lot. I mean, I think growing up, especially growing up in Atlanta,
Hmm.
you don't understand the separation that happened between um, sort of the beloved community segment of the movement and the Black Power segment of the movement, right? So your Dr. Kings and your John Lewises and your James Farmers, and then your Stokely Carmichaels and your Floyd McKissicks on the other side. And I think for me, that was something that I really just in embarking on this project wanted to know as much as I possibly could about, because I think we're seeing in our politics today factions, right? I mean, the
Hmm.
framers talked about it in the Federalist Papers, and then it's just continued to play out throughout our history. And understanding the factions of the movement help us understand how we got to where we are, and in many ways how the other side used those factions against the movement and against the young people, and then also selectively use their tactics against them. And so understanding how that developed, why. I mean, I think, when you talk to John Lewis, he would talk about Stokely with he was still mad about 1966 after all these years. I mean, to him, that was kind of like the this like wound that never
Hmm.
fully healed. And so then, if you take his point of view on Stokely without understanding Stokely's point of view, right?
Right.
There's a note in the end notes that I think summed it up, right? Which is what we're confronting right now. And if you don't understand this, you don't understand the movement itself, which is that, Stokely blamed to a certain extent Watts and some of these riots actually on the nonviolent portion of the movement, because he was saying that young people being beaten, the image of this violence and this physical hatred towards people of color, and the acceptance of it as if they were supposed to bear this burden,
Right.
created a different kind of radicalism, right? Because they were dramatizing it on TV, and it worked to provoke white backlash, but it also provoked this black backlash, because it was people watching their own kind suffer and hurt and be allowed to essentially be murdered in public view. And it was, this is before cell phones. This is before even the press was willing to cover a lot of these issues, right?
Yeah.
And that tension, I think we're seeing it right now, whether we're seeing it in Israel and Palestine, or we're
Hmm.
seeing it here in America. These issues of an awakening happening at seeing violence of people who maybe aren't part of your immediate community, but who are like you and facing this violence around the country and around the world. We're going to have to come to terms with that, and we still haven't.
Now, one of the great strengths about both of the books, the March trilogy and this new book, Run, is that you don't shy away from the truth. And we know, as you were stating, and as I was reading Run, I have to admit, in my history, have viewed the whole civil rights period of all of us on this side of the civil rights, we were still locked in arms, and it's a kumbaya moment and everything. And so when you reference that whole thing about the distinction and the differences between the different groups, the SCLC, SNCC, NAACP, then it really did come across that there was that division. So there were ugly aspects of things, as we knew, but there were these complications which a lot of us didn't know about. And so, how in the world, because these books are geared towards teens and tweens. And so, I just want to know, through this creative process, how in the world did you figure out balancing the honest portrayal of that, and while still letting the reader continue to hope?
That's a great question, and it's a very difficult one. You know, it starts with following the story itself, right?
Hmm.
Find as much information as you can, and what their words were, and try not to editorialize, right? Congressman would always say, make it real, make it plain, don't sweep anything under the rug. And I think when March came out, I felt like a third person viewer of these interactions, right?
Right.
But over time, it would they kept inviting me into the room. I'll never forget being in Austin, Texas, and they were having a summit at the LBJ Presidential Library, a summit on civil rights. And I'm in the room with John Lewis, Julian Bond, Vernon Jordan.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, it was this incredible gathering, right? And in that, right, and March had come out, and all of a sudden their stories are getting told a little bit more to young people in ways. And I'll never forget Julian coming up to me and saying, well, I did a comic book in 1966. And you're like, I was like, I know, tell me all about it. He's got, I got a few in the basement. And I'm like, come on, man, hook me up, And it's like you build these friendships and these relationships, and it makes them go from being characters living in your head to
Right.
friends and family members. And it helps in many ways for you to be able to see how they interact when they're actually in person. A couple other people who were very helpful for this book was Cortland Cox and Jennifer Lawson, who we talk about, and they were creators of those comics that Snick made in Lowndes County in '66, which I hope this book also shines a light on, because much like Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story inspired people to nonviolence, this was a wave of comics that were being used to educate people about the roles and responsibilities of elected officials, which, I mean, when you think about it at the time, is just mind-blowingly like ahead of its time. These are people who aren't just academic subjects. They're real people to me who I care about deeply. And so then imagine you're telling a story not about this academic subject that you're studying, but your favorite aunts and your favorite uncles, and how they worked together, and how they fought, and how they came back together, and the ups and the downs. That's really what it became. And that's where, as much as there was pressure from the public, or the expectations wanting this book or wanting more of these, is it going to be good, all these questions, the real pressure came from the thought of letting any of these people down.
I hear you. I hear you. As I read this, it came across that you all were so respectful. So when you mentioned how the congressman was still angry with Stokely, you feel his pain when he loses and he heads back home. But I love the fact that you recognize that there was another side to the story, as you said. And so the fact that you at times reflect, in reflection or upon reflection, and then they use his words then for how he's looking back on it and looking at it at that point in time, he's able to determine that, well, I may not have been exactly right, but this is my side. This is my telling. And it leaves the door open for the other people to share their side. And I thought that was fabulous. That was a great way to handle that.
Well, I think too often we try and create the definitive version rather than
Hmm.
creating something that expands the conversation and gives all these people a seat at the table so that they can tell their story, and we can have a discussion about what memory really is, and what really happened, and hopefully somewhere in that discussion find a synthesis that is the actual truth. But I think when we were talking about what really happened, and the idea that John Lewis was telling his version of this, right?
Hmm.
When you look at this segment about who he blamed,
Yes.
this is something that you even see it between his books, where
Hmm.
his philosophy developed on it, right? So like after the coup, when he wrote in Walking with the Wind, he like blamed Jim Foreman for it up and down, right? And so I'm talking to Cortland, I'm talking to some of the other SNCC members, people who were in the room when that happened, and I'm like, was this really Foreman? I mean, like they kicked him out too. Like, why would Foreman set him up that way? And then it comes out, they're like, actually, that might have been a little more Cleve Sellers, like, and then these different people, and you start to have this because some of the folks are dead too, right? Like they don't
Right.
have the opportunity to defend themselves.
Right.
And so you really, when you sit down, and I remember us sitting down and having to have that really frank conversation with like the congressman, where it's sir, I know you felt like Foreman did it, and I know you've said that many times, but this is what I'm hearing from your colleagues. Do you still really feel that way? And him coming around to the fact that, he didn't really know, but he was so hurt. And that
Hmm.
hurt stayed with him for so long. And he felt like Foreman had been undermining him, using his power with the money in the organization to control people, even though John Lewis was the chairman. And this is a kind of a constant thing in John Lewis's political life later, where the idea of you have this powerful person who's actually controlling the money, and John Lewis is a figurehead, and that people, because he didn't like to handle money. It wasn't something, it was his forte. And
Hmm.
people take advantage of that. He's such a moral force that, they think they can control him. And you can see that having played out later in Congress and in other places. But at the root of it, John Lewis was so independent and strong, especially at that age, that he wasn't controllable, and he was fighting for what he really believed in. And finding the right way to say that as honestly and authentically as possible
Hmm.
was my challenge, right? That's what I had to do for the congressman, and be that person who asked him the tough questions. And I don't think, I think this is, I see the other biographers and I see them write about him, and it's like they knew him or they knew of him,
Hmm.
but I don't. It never felt like they had the standing with him to be like, Congressman, I'm going to call you out on this though, because they would just take it and write it down, and you had to push back on him and say, well, this is what other people have said. This is the facts. This is the report I'm reading. Like, what do you really think? And I think in that, it really became a different kind of book even than March, because this is such a controversial period. And I'm so glad that we were able to get this down on paper before he passed, because I think being able to look back at it from his perspective at the end of his life really changed how it's told.
One of the things, and I don't know if this was intentional, so you tell me, but in thinking about the March book and his preaching to the chickens, and then there is a scene in Run in which the chickens are a parent, and I'm like, okay, is this symbolic in some way? Because he's heading back home
Right.
after the loss. So, can you tell me or tell us anything about that?
Yeah, his whole life he had chicken imagery all around his office, all around his home. And so when we were talking about that portion where he finally went back home, right? This is a person who had pushed himself to the near the edge of exhaustion and given
Hmm.
his everything. And he talked about like going back home and seeing his chickens again, and that made him feel like he was home. And at the same time, I mean, we were having this discussion because this isn't directly related to the book, but it was part of our conversation, which is that after my mother passed in 2017, she had moved to rural Western North Carolina because she wanted to start a small nursery. And so she started this farm. She'd sold the house in Atlanta, had a little plot of land, and worked it basically until she died. And after she passed, my way of just confronting this loss was to go back on weekends and when we had breaks, and I would write at the farm and work in the fields. I got a tractor. I would, I did everything except for get farm animals. And he would tease me. He'd say, well, when are you going to get some chickens? It's not a farm until you have chickens. And then finally he started teasing me. He'd be like, I spent all my life trying to get off the farm, and now you're trying to go back. And that scene held so much emotional significance for us, because at that point we were talking so much about the farm. In fact, when we were working on that, he actually had come out to my home in North Carolina. We did a talk here out there to a school that I knew, and he visited. We went out to lunch. We walked around. The thing we didn't get to do that he really wanted to do was go antiquing.
Oh.
But that's another story. And it was farm life, the rural nature of his upbringing. I think as someone who became so well known as an urban politician, it's important to remind people that's where he went to recharge. Even when he was in Congress, when he would talk about where he wanted to go to relax, he would just say, "I just want to go back to my brothers and sit and fish," and that was his escape. And in many ways, that was both of our escapes as we're both going through this period. And he's trying to help me as I'm grieving the loss of my mother. And there's just so much significance wrapped up in that the chickens had to come back. There had to be a way to show it. But that also speaks to the power of graphic novels,
Yes.
because we said a lot without saying anything. We showed rather than told.
The book starts out like that with this small image right on. I don't know if it's the preface or the acknowledgement page, but it's a powerful small illustration of an old pair of beat up, worn shoes with a visible hole in the bottom of the sole. And I looked at that before even turning to the first page to read and thought, all God's children got shoes. And so I don't know whose decision that was to place that, but placement and just those shoes right there, knowing that you're coming from the March series and the walking that they did, the marching, and knowing that the title of this one is Run, it was like it hit me and struck me. And I think it just encourages the reader's curiosity to move things forward.
That was one of those things that was a later decision. I think there had been a draft of another illustration at that point, and it was like John Lewis with other elected officials or something like that. And I remember us having a conversation about like symbolism, and
Mhm.
and that it you needed to really show the wear and tear, because that's what Run also shows: the wear and tear on John Lewis, the wear
Mhm.
and tear on the organization. That he was taking off his worn out marching shoes and he was about to put on his dress shoes and go be a different kind of leader. And Nate had done that illustration, and I think it was originally going to go somewhere in the back matter. And we
Mhm.
moved it to the front because we felt the symbolism was so powerful that it would say a lot more than anything else we could do.
The incredible Stacey Abrams says
Yeah.
the new book, Run, that it recounts the lost history of what too often follows dramatic change, the pushback of those who refuse it, and the resistance of those who believe change has not gone far enough. Why is it so important to show socially conscious young people that, as you say in the book, progress never moves in a straight line?
Stacey Abrams is this perfect symbol in many ways for what we're trying to show young people today. Just because she didn't win the gubernatorial election, eh, she didn't stop. And,
Right.
and in many ways, she probably had a greater impact than many other governors,
Mhm.
right, on the future of this country. I got to know Stacey Abrams with the congressman campaigning in 2016. I had been working on the presidential campaign, and it was funny because March was out, but I had my political hat on, and we're driving all over rural Georgia. We're stopping at all these meet and threes, and seeing her work a room alongside the congressman, it was uncanny, right? It's one of those things where you're like, okay, the future is going to be fine. As somebody who was in politics, who was also writing on the side, for me, she was always kind of a role model, because it's like, you can do this. You don't have to separate those two parts of your life.
Mhm.
I think being a staff member made it a little bit harder, but now I'm not, and I can be my own person. And so she's just provided such an incredible example. And I hope when young people read this book, by having her on the back of it, they connect all those dots and they understand that the struggle we're talking about, that is depicted here 55 or 50 years ago, 60 years ago, is very much alive today, and that now it's their opportunity to not just be the next John Lewis, but to be the next Stacey Abrams.
Well, Andrew, I want to thank you. I want to thank the folks in ALA for joining us this morning. We hope this conversation's encouraged them to get involved with the democratic process in their own communities and to continue Congressman Lewis's legacy of getting into quote unquote good trouble. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose.